State management. What is it? Why should I care about it? And how do I properly manage state within React? Okay, so state is a piece of data that changes over time. And in the case of front ends, we can react to these changes in the user interface itself. So think of a modal. A modal has two sets of states. A modal can either be opened or it can be closed. And we can use a concept known as conditional rendering in order to either show or hide the modal. Now, looking at a more complicated example, we can think of a user dashboard. How does an application know to show a dashboard when a user logs in? This can be done with a piece of state that we're getting from the API. So user authentication workflows vary between how they're implemented, but ultimately it boils down to getting a user object from an API and then persisting that state throughout the application so that multiple pieces of components can access this user object. Now, that's all well and good, but why should I even care about managing my states? Like, is the user even going to notice a difference in the way I implement different workflows? Well, there are two reasons. One, managing state properly leads to a better developer experience, and two, it just makes it easier for different components to access pieces of information that are needed. Now, if you've been working with React for a while, one of the first things you learn is something called props. And you might be asking, can't I just pass all this information that I'm getting down through props into the components that need them? And the answer is yes, you can absolutely do that, but there is a problem with that. We're going to take a look at an example in order to show you how this problem can arise. So, in this example, what we're looking at is a component tree where we are rendering out a navigation bar and something that is going to be somewhere further down the page. Just walking you through the structure of this application, we have an app where we're rendering out a nav bar component, which we see up here, and a demo box. If we go into the demo box file, we're just rendering out this display username, which we see here. This is supposed to represent a component that is supposed to be further down the page if we were to scroll down and actually build out this dashboard. So in this example, what we want to illustrate is how storing state within components makes it really tricky in order to access them in other components. Right now, this username that you see up here is inside of the navbar components. Now, let's pretend that we were actually building out this dashboard and our manager has told us that this username object that we're going to get back from an API of sorts, we also need access to this information somewhere further down the page. Now, the way this is set up, it's very tricky to do that. And it would, well, basically, it's impossible for us to do that right now without implementing some sort of other mechanism of storing this piece of state. So, what we can do, and what most people often do, is that they use the React concept is lifting up the state. What that means is that we can take this username state or data and place it in a component that is apparent to both the navbar and the demo box. In this case, this would be the app component. So let's just go ahead and do that and then we'll take it from there. So we can take the username state or data. Right now it's just a variable, but really you'd be using the use state hook. We can take it out of the navbar components and then pass it down. We can take it out of the navbar components. React is going to yell at us right now, but we'll fix that in a second. We can place it inside of the app components. Remember, we're doing this because the app components, the navbar and the demo box components are children of the app, so we can pass them down. We can pass this username down as props to both the navbar and the demo box. So we can say that we're going to set a username prop. We're going to set this both to the username and the demo box, meaning that we're passing this piece of information down as props into these components so that they each have access to it. So if we take a save here and then go back into the nav bar, let's just copy the prop name and then accept these props inside of the nav bar and then just render whatever those props are. If we take a save, we see the exact same thing here. Nothing has changed. Now, if we go into the demo box and we do the same thing, get the props, and we hit save, what we can see here is now we can see the name being rendered in the demo box component. This is only happening because the username object is in a space where the demo box is accepting the username as props. Now, this becomes very handy because now we have the ability to store pieces of information that we need amongst different components in a top level component and then just pass it down as props. But there's a danger to doing this, though, because it leads to something known as prop drilling. Inside this nav bar component, we're also rendering a submenu component. Submenu is a child of nav bar, meaning that wherever nav bar is rendered, submenu is rendered. Now, we built this actual application in a previous video that we did before, but basically how this works is that it uses conditional rendering to open and close this submenu, depending on if this button has been clicked or not. So if we want to render this username inside of the submenu, because submenu is a child of navbar, we can pass in as props the props that we're receiving from the apps. So this username prop here, if we want to render the username inside of submenu, we'd have to pass in the username as props to submenu. But submenu is a child of navbar, and navbar is a child of app. So we define our state in app, we pass it down into navbar, and then we pass that down into submenu. This results in a term known as prop drilling. So we can say username props to, it's going to be equal to the props that we're receiving from the app. We hit save, we can see the username being rendered in the submenu. Now, this doesn't really look too bad because this is just a small piece of state. But if we were working on a larger application, this could get very complicated for other developers involved. The other downside to doing this is that we may not even need to render the username within the nav bar, but we need to render it within submenu. So now, if we were to remove this username from navbar, we would remove it from the navbar, but still render it inside the submenu. So now this navbar component is just a passageway to get information from the top level all the way down to the submenu component that is rendered inside of navbar. This is not really ideal, and there are much better ways to do this, and we'll take a look at that after. Now, we've just seen how prop drilling can lead to a very poor developer experience, and while it is a very viable option, it's not recommended to do. Now, you might be asking, are there any other ways for me to manage my state within an application? And yeah, there is. There are state management libraries that are available for us to use. Libraries such as the Context API, Redux, with most recently Redux Toolkit, Recoil, and there are other state management libraries as well. The cool thing is that these libraries, they allow us to decouple the data from the individual components themselves and store the data in something called a store. You can think of a store like a separate location, and if an individual component needs access to a piece of data, they can go to that store, get that data, and have it for that specific component that needs it. So the question then becomes, when do I use this local state or state that is stored within the component itself? And when do I use this global state that is stored within this global store to have many components have access to this information? A question that I personally ask myself is, do many components need access to this information, or is it just this one component that needs access to it? If it's many components that need access to this information, then I go with a global store. If it is just one component that needs access to this information, then I go with a local state. So, from the examples earlier, to know whether a modal has been either opened or closed, it's more likely to be a local state. It may be a global state sometimes if this action is needed somewhere else, but it's more likely to be a local state. And whereas with the example of a user object, where many components within your application are going to have need to know if a user is logged in, this would more likely be a global state. So you would set up an external store that would have a lot of other components go access that information. We've just looked at state management as a whole and why it's important to manage your state within an application. Later on, we'll be diving into how to set up one of these state management libraries in order to have this global state so that you can persist information across your application to allow multiple components to have access to a lot of information without prop trailing. Don't forget to hit the like button down below, and I'll catch you in the next one. Peace.